Having scientists and researchers challenge each other's evidence base is standard procedure in the academic community. Questioning the validity and reliability of evidence is essential for assuring proper interpretation and application of research findings. In part 3, Dr. Strauss critiques the neuroscience evidence base of the science of reading and directly addresses a controversy raised by fellow neuroscientist Dr. Stanislas Dehaene in his 2009 book, Reading in the Brain.
Okay, let's turn to teaching. I just want to say that even if the SOR people are absolutely correct about their theory of reading, that doesn't mean that that's how you teach reading. Letter by letter, sound by sound, syllable by syllable. If you want to teach a dancer how to dance, do you first have to show them how to point their big toe and how to move their ankle and how to hold their arms up, first their fingers and then their elbows and then their shoulders? Or do you show them the whole movement? Well, knowing dancers as I do, I'm married to one, that's not the way it occurs. And yet, by showing the holistic components of dance, dancers can still be created. It's so that, in other words, we don't have to teach component parts of a process in order to teach the process itself. The SOR people claim that youngsters who are directly taught phonics become better at reading, spelling, and comprehension, and that anybody who's denying this reality is neglecting the needs of their students. Well, I would say, as I've mentioned already, that this is turning everything on its head. It's the SOR people who are neglecting decades of research on real reading, the reading of natural text. They don't have to do, the researchers on real reading don't have to apologize for the materials they use. These are real texts. Isn't that what we all want to get at? What does a reader do? Here's miscue analysis studies. Here are eye movement studies. Here are studies of how readers interact with literate environments, books in the home, and so on. That's research on that for decades and decades is completely ignored by the SOR people. So a theory or an approach to teaching reading actually has to take into account, if we're not going to teach one piece by one piece, two things. What is reading all about, but also what is teaching all about and what is learning all about? They need to go to professionals, professional teachers, professional educators, researchers on how teaching should occur because of the results that we see, how learning takes place, before they can really say anything about the best way to teach reading. What theory of teaching and learning points to phonics as the right way to teach reading, even if they can prove that phonics is a central component of reading? What theory of teaching and learning tells them that we therefore have to utilize that? None that I know of. They won't actually ever go to professional teachers, professional educators, researchers in teaching and learning, because at this stage of the game, they don't really have to. They have the government on their side. They're in the classrooms, mandated in almost every state in the country. It's good to see that CABE is protesting. CABE, I think, is at the forefront of these protests, which is a wonderful thing. Okay. Here are some examples of places they could go if they wanted to. Scholars like Freire and others about teaching and learning. Teachers can police themselves just as doctors can. Okay, let's turn. I think we're getting close towards the end. I think. Here's a part of a picture of the brain. It's kind of cut down the middle. You're seeing the right side of the brain from the inside. You're seeing the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe with the dotted arrow is actually on that other side. You see the occipital lobe in the back. The thalamus is something you see right there in the middle, that green egg. So I want you to keep in mind the thalamus. It is traditionally taught, and I was taught this in medical school, that all sensory information goes from the outside of the body through the thalamus to the higher levels of the brain where it is now interpreted. Sound goes into the thalamus. The thalamus will send it now to the temporal lobe. Visual input goes to the thalamus. The thalamus directs it to the occipital lobe, and so on. The only sense that does not go through the thalamus is the sense of smell. That goes somewhere else. But generally, the thalamus is thought of as the relay station, as you see in this quote, the gatekeeper, the part of the brain that collects the sensory information and feeds it to higher levels, the cortex, where it's all interpreted, where meaning is constructed. There is new research, well, relatively new, it's been out for some time. Well, I should say a couple of decades, as you see. This one by a researcher whose name I can't pronounce, so I apologize. I just don't know how to sound it out, I guess, where he and his collaborators have found that there are neurons which connect the thalamus to the cortex, that's known, as well as connecting the cortex to the thalamus. And lo and behold, there are 10 times as many neurons that connect the cortex, the part of the brain that interprets, that predicts, that organizes, that thinks. There are 10 times as many neurons connecting the cortex to the thalamus as there are connecting the thalamus to the cortex. And they reached the conclusion that, you know what? It looks like the cortex is controlling the thalamus and not the other way around. Instead of the cortex sending sensory information like letters on a page, visual letters on a page, to the cortex for interpretation, for the construct, for meaning, instead of that going through the thalamus, the cortex is already coming up with a meaning and telling the thalamus what to look for. It goes back and forth. It's a dual way, a two-way process, which is not the process advocated by the SoR advocates, but this is an important new direction in neurophysiology and neuroanatomy, the relationship between the higher levels and the lower levels, where the higher levels more and more now are being understood as places that start first. They make predictions about meaning, about what they're about to see, what they're about to hear, and use the information coming through the thalamus to confirm or disconfirm those predictions. So the socio-psycholinguistic approach to reading, operating within the constructivist framework of psychology, also has its brain research and its understanding of how the brain works to understand reading. The SoR people are not the only ones who can claim science of the brain to support their theory of reading. And here you see many more neurons connecting the cortex. The neocortex is the most advanced part of the brain, connecting them to the thalamus. I just drew one neuron connecting the thalamus to the higher parts of the brain. We already went through whether the brain extracts information and meaning or constructs it. I won't deal with that. We went through how the MRI can study otherwise meaningless things, that the different methodologies of SoR versus transactional socio-psycholinguistic research. And let me just end then with some comments by Professor Dahan, who has been called the guru of functional MRI studies on reading and other studies as well, other topics as well. He states that the whole language approach to reading has been officially abandoned, whatever that means. What does officially abandoned mean? And that so many teachers are confused by the constant back and forth, but the burden of guilt is on both teachers and psychologists for this confusion. The scientists are just trying to enlighten them, and they are spreading misinformation by not yet abandoning the socio-psycholinguistic approach, even though that approach has been officially abandoned. What does that mean? That there are laws that have abandoned it? Well, yes, there are laws that have abandoned it, and it did not come about because that's what the teachers wanted. Let me say a little bit about legislation that was proposed by the California legislature recently. Proposed, but it did not reach its final stages. If anybody is wondering what it means to say that that whole language has been officially abandoned, we can simply look at this one example. Officially means the government wants to impose this approach to reading, the SOR approach to reading, in all of its classrooms. There are many states, most, and some sources I read say all, but I haven't confirmed that yet, which have a mandate for SOR reading model in the classroom. And that's probably the best interpretation we could make for this idea that whole language has been officially abandoned. I could repeat or point out that it was not officially abandoned by teachers, students, and parents. Dahan, regarding sentences, he said a few things. For example, he said, what Strauss, says is so utterly false that it betrays a dramatic lack of knowledge of the scientific literature. We've been studying sentences for years and years. Well, let me remind you that stimuli may be called sentences, but they're often artificial sentences, or they often need to be supplemented for the fMRI machines to study them. Remember that sentences pose the problem of temporal resolution, and many of the researchers supplement that with eye movement or other excellent temporal resolution machines. A lot of sentence reading studies have the words of the sentence presented one word at a time with equal spacing. John read a book. Okay, if you want to call that a sentence, then I'm not aware of the sentence research. Some of them present the sentence by pausing when the last word is presented. That's the word they're interested in. John read a book. Is that a sentence? I would say it's a sentence-like piece of linguistic material. Okay. Dahan says that, well, he doesn't know what whole language is based on his book, published in 2009, when there was plenty of research already on whole language. If you go to the index of his book, Reading in the Brain, published 2009, and look up whole language, you'll find a lot of entries. There's nothing for whole word, but when you go to the pages that allegedly have something now about whole language, because that's the expression in the index, he mixes up whole language and whole word in such a way that it's very clear that he has never studied the difference between the two of them, and that he is ignoring 60 years of research on whole language. Well, here I wrote that he's ignoring it. He says that regarding miscues and alleged opposition to phonics by people who like miscues and eye movement studies, that here's one interesting thing that Professor Dahan says: the physical limits of the eyes cannot be overcome unless one is willing to skip words and thus run the risk of a misunderstanding. If you skip a word when you're reading, you might not understand the text. We know that that's not true. We know that that's not true because we know that good readers who understand what they're reading, skip words. That's what a real reader does, a real proficient reader, a reader who can tell you when you ask them, what was this about? They can tell you at length what it was about. And then you look at what they read, you make markings. Did they skip this one? Did they skip that one? You tape record it and so on. Well, you record it on what we use now for recordings, and they skip a lot of words. Why is that? Why is that you can skip words and still understand what you read? The science of reading people have zero explanation for that. In fact, they would predict just the opposite from their theory, that in order to understand, you have to go word by word. Dehaan also says that the whole language movement was vigorously opposed to phonics. The whole language movement is opposed to using phonics as the primary teaching mechanism. But the whole language movement has acknowledged ad nauseum that phonics does play a role in reading. It's one of the many cueing systems. It's one of the many resources that readers use to make sense of print. They use their background knowledge to make sense of print. They use their knowledge of the world. They use their knowledge of grammar, syntax, and semantics. And they also use phonics. But phonics for a good reader is used only as a method of last resort. All of the other resources that I just mentioned are so laden with meaning, so filled with meaning. And phonics is not at all. Phonics is the one cueing system that is not filled with meaning whatsoever. But the ones that are filled with meaning, semantics, your knowledge of the world, all that stuff, of course it allows you to interpret meaning quicker and more efficiently than phonics. Dehaan says about whole language many things. Oh, here's one that he says regarding whole language, that the people who were involved in it were subjected to the miseries of the so-called whole word method. By whole word, he means whole language, because in the index it says whole language. You get to that page and he says whole word. He clearly doesn't know the difference between the two. What miseries is he talking about? That readers in a whole language program, children, can pick out their own books, that enjoy reading circles with the teachers? What miseries is he talking about? The real misery comes from readers, children learning to read, who have to practice letter-sound relationships all day and not know what in the world they're doing. He says that many teachers and psychologists who do this are deluded, and that they deny the role of teaching teaching phonics. And as I just now said, that's absolutely incorrect. Regarding the unnaturalness of reading, because reading is a cultural invention, here's where he endorses that. And in the next one, on the limitations of MRI, well, he does say, to his credit, that functional MRI is too slow. Remember, I mentioned that earlier. The blood gets there way after the neurons activate. fMRI is too slow for the real-time visualization of brain activity. Functional MRI only allows us to see brain activity that occurred several seconds earlier. Such delays and smearing severely limit our observation of brain activity. Thank you very much, Professor Dehaan. Regarding the use of context, well, what's the biggest context that very young readers have in their books? It's pictures. They use the pictures as context to help them construct meaning. But Professor Dehaan says, I am wary of the many richly decorated reading manuals. Okay, these are manuals, not children's books, that contain more illustrations than text. Well, what are the illustrations doing there? They're there to help the reader construct meaning. Is that a problem? On spelling reform, we have to do it because we have to make it easier for the reader to sound out letters. With all this spelling problems, it's going to make it more difficult. And here's a choice phrase from Professor Dehaan, Dr. Dehaan. If we were to, listen to this, if we were to avoid writing the sound F with both the letter F and PH, life would be much simpler. Okay. And on the genetics, he acknowledges that there is a genetic basis for dyslexia susceptibility. I would like to know what he thinks about the contradiction in that I raised earlier. If I'm wrong, I'd be happy to acknowledge that. I just would like to hear an argument for it. And here's a good one. I don't understand this one at all. He says, when we are confronted with words that are frequent or whose pronunciation is exceptional, our reading takes a direct route, not necessarily sounding it out, in other words, it takes a direct route that first recovers the identity and meaning of the word and then uses the lexical information to recover its pronunciation. Why in the world would you have any need to recover a word's pronunciation if you already know what it means? Isn't that the goal? Isn't the goal to get to the meaning of the word from all of the elements of the word prior to it, from its letters, its sounds, its roots, morphemes, and so on? Well, if you have a direct route to meaning, because you have to avoid phonics because it's just too messy for that word, there is no need to go back from meaning to recover pronunciation. So that's why my title for that one is, okay, we can summarize just by saying that, well, there are several approaches to reading. They all claim to be scientific. They all claim to be evidence-based. They all claim to have to do with language. Reading is not a theory of reading is not a theory of reading unless it is about reading. And reading means reading real texts, natural texts. If you study experimentally chopped up language and want to extrapolate to naturalistic texts, you have to show how that's done. You have to have a theory of language that explains how in the world you can do that. Ethnographic research says that you actually cannot do that. Can an anthropologist who studies culture tell some people to no longer go out hunting and they want to see what the remaining people will do? You can't stop, let's say, a hunter-gatherer society from hunting to see what the gatherers will now do. It's not only unethical, but it completely distorts the nature of that culture, the nature of that community, and what the remaining gatherers will do. It does not allow us to draw conclusions about the full nature of that society. Anthropologists do ethnographic research. There are many other aspects in the summary, or many other points in the summary that I made here. How the science, the so-called science of research, is not just linguistically flawed and scientifically flawed in terms of methodology, but it is highly political. And as much as we on our side have the scientific basis for claiming that SOR is utterly preposterous, that does not matter today as much as it should. This is not simply a scientific debate. The SOR people are in power politically. They have the legislators on their side. They have government funding on their side. They have funding by right-wing corporations on their side. What it is going to take to defeat them is not just more articles in journals, as welcome as those are. They're going to have to be defeated politically. And I don't mean simply electing people who say the right things. Both Bush and Obama were on the wrong side of this particular question. We need to have strong educational measures for teachers and students and parents so they know what's happening to them. We need public forums to educate the public about this. We need to do what is done in many other political movements. We have to see it as a movement and not simply a debate in the academic journals. And what I hope I've been able to do today is provide you with a lot of the thinking that takes place among opponents of SOR, to provide some scientific ammunition. But I also hope that I've provided a strong rationale for why we need to go beyond the mere academic debate, as important as that is, and organize ourselves politically. So I want to thank everyone again for attending, and be patiently listening to what I have to say, hopefully finding it interesting. And I want to thank especially all of the organizers of this event and all of the people who know technology far better than I do, who were able to help me. Once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
CAPE also invites you to utilize the resources provided in the list of references at the end of Part 3. These references include Dr. Strauss's books and research studies that thoroughly document his perspective based on his expertise as a linguist and neuroscientist, as well as supporting research studies.